Imagine this. You're lying in bed again, eyes wide open, mind wide awake. But nothing in you wants to move. Your body's still, but your brain is sprinting. You replay that thing you said 3 days ago. You predict tomorrow's conversations. You imagine worst-case scenarios you know won't happen, but feel like they might. You rehearse who you should be, what you should have done, and how it all could go wrong again. And when you finally notice how loud it's gotten, it's too late. You're already caught inside the loop. If you've ever felt like your brain just won't shut up, if you've ever looked calm on the outside while your thoughts spin you into paralysis, stay with this. You're about to understand why the people who think the most often feel the most stuck. This is the trap they never warned you about. When your mind is always on, it starts to feel like a superpower. You're observant, you're analytical, you don't miss a thing. But at some point, and you know exactly when it started, that mental sharpness turned on you. Now every thought branches into 5 more. Every feeling demands analysis. Every choice feels like a test. And the worst part? It looks invisible. You're not screaming. You're not melting down. You're just thinking. But under the surface, you feel it. That tightness in your chest, the fatigue in your jaw, the fog behind your eyes. You're not solving problems anymore. You're drowning in the illusion of control. And no one sees it. Not your friends. Not your co-workers. To them, you're just thoughtful, intense, maybe a little quiet. But inside, you're stuck in a spiral you can't explain and can't escape. At first, awareness feels like liberation. You start noticing things others don't. You become self-aware, emotionally intelligent, introspective. You understand your patterns, your past, your pain. You start to figure yourself out. But then something strange happens. That awareness becomes a trap. You notice so much that you no longer know what to do with it. You think through every interaction before it happens. You replay conversations for hours. You analyze your emotions instead of feeling them. You observe your thoughts instead of living through them. And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, you stop participating in life and start monitoring it. This is the dark side of being self-aware. You're always trying to manage your internal world like a machine, trying to regulate every possible emotion, trying to predict every possible outcome, trying to stay ahead of the chaos. But life doesn't work like that. And so your thoughts turn against you. You analyze to avoid action. You reflect to avoid risk. You stay in your head because your heart doesn't feel safe anymore. The world told you that overthinking is just a bad habit, that if you just let go, things would be fine. But that's not how it works, is it? Because when you stop overthinking, the feelings come up. The fear, the grief, the uncertainty. And that's what the spiral is protecting you from. Not the future, but yourself. There's a hidden kind of shame buried in this loop. It says, you're smart. You should be better than this. And so instead of asking for help, you try to think your way out of the hole and dig yourself in deeper. It's not that you don't know what's happening. It's that you know too well and still feel powerless to stop it. Carl Jung once observed that people will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid confronting their own souls. Not because the soul is inherently frightening, but because it demands a kind of honesty that the mind alone cannot provide. Overthinking, in Jung's view, is not merely a cognitive habit. It is often a subtle form of avoidance, a way of insulating the self from a more profound confrontation with the unknown within. In his psychological framework, Jung introduced the concept of inflation. a condition in which the ego becomes overly identified with the intellect. The thinking mind, instead of serving the whole psyche, attempts to dominate it. It expands, not through wisdom, but through control, absorbing more and more psychic energy in an effort to manage what it does not understand. The inflated mind becomes the center of gravity, displacing emotion, instinct, and even spiritual intuition. This is not a neutral shift. It leads to a particular kind of psychological fragmentation. When you live primarily in the mind, your thoughts become detached from the rest of your being. Emotions are not felt. They are analyzed. Instincts are not trusted. They are scrutinized. Decisions are not made. They are postponed through endless loops of mental rehearsal. And yet, this kind of inflation is seductive. It offers a false sense of mastery over life. The thinker feels safe because they are always planning, always scanning, always working on themselves. But underneath this apparent self-awareness lies a deeper fear, the fear of surrendering control, of feeling something that cannot be rationalized, of stepping into an experience that cannot be solved like a problem. Jung understood that when the thinking function becomes inflated, it no longer serves the individual's growth. Instead, it becomes a defense mechanism, a psychic stronghold built to keep the unconscious at bay. The overactive mind is not inherently a sign of intelligence. More often, it is a symptom of inner disconnection. The loop is not the problem, it is the signal. As Jung put it, the task of individuation, the journey toward wholeness, cannot be achieved through thought alone. It requires integration. It requires descent into the parts of the self that are irrational, emotional, and unknown. The danger of inflation is that it convinces you that you can bypass this journey by thinking harder. But in doing so, you become trapped, not by your limitations, but by your refusal to face what lies beneath them. Overthinking, then, is not simply a mental excess. It is the ego's strategy to escape the humility required by inner truth. Søren Kierkegaard once described anxiety not as a flaw in human nature, but as an inevitable consequence of freedom. He called it the dizziness of possibility, a psychological vertigo that arises when we are faced not with one path, but with infinite ones. For Kierkegaard, anxiety was not about the fear of danger. It was about the burden of choice. And in this light, overthinking reveals itself as something far more existential than we tend to admit. It is not just the brain overworking itself. It is the spirit flailing in the face of too many potential selves, too many futures, too many consequences, too much uncertainty, and no clear ground to stand on. When we are young, we are told that freedom is a gift. But Kierkegaard knew what modern life makes all too clear, that freedom without grounding can become a curse. The more choices we face about who to be, how to act, what path to take, the more we spiral, not outward, but inward, into paralysis. Overthinking, then, is not simply excessive cognition. It is the ego's attempt to delay commitment. We think and think again, not because we are indecisive, but because every choice represents a death. The death of all the other possibilities we did not choose. And with that comes grief, often invisible, but quietly suffocating. This is why the overthinker rarely feels satisfaction. Even after choosing, the mind reopens the question. It wonders, was that the right move? What if I missed something? What if I was wrong? And so the loop continues, not because the path is unclear, but because the self is still fragmented, still unwilling to bear the weight of decision, of responsibility, of self-authorship. Kierkegaard believed that despair emerges when the self refuses to become itself, when we shrink back from the task of being. Overthinking is one of the most elegant forms of this refusal. It disguises itself as diligence, as caution, as care. But beneath it lies fear. Fear of failing, fear of becoming, fear of stepping into a future where guarantees no longer exist. And so we remain suspended, mentally busy, emotionally stagnant, spiritually adrift. But no amount of thinking can resolve the existential tension of being human. Eventually, as Kierkegaard warned, the only way out is through. Not through clarity, but through commitment. Not through perfection, but through presence. We tend to treat overthinking like a bad habit, something to be broken, silenced, or fixed. But what if it's not the problem at all? What if overthinking is the psyche's way of telling you that something inside has gone quiet, and it's trying to fill the silence? When someone is overthinking, it's rarely because they're overwhelmed with too many thoughts. More often, they're overwhelmed with too few truths. No strong yes, no solid center, just noise, mental motion without direction. This is why efforts to quiet the mind often fail. Because the overthinking isn't random, it's serving a purpose. It's protecting you from the very thing you haven't yet named: uncertainty, shame, loss, fear, truth. And as long as that deeper thing remains unacknowledged, the loop continues. What makes this trap so difficult to escape is that it mimics progress. You feel like you're working on something. You feel responsible, thoughtful, self-aware. But underneath it all, you're circling the same terrain. No new clarity, no real movement, just orbit. This is where the loop becomes spiritual, because what it hides is not more information, but a disconnection from instinct, alignment, and inner authority. Overthinking thrives where self-trust is missing. When you no longer trust your emotions, you analyze them. When you no longer trust your desires, you second-guess them. When you no longer trust your path, you study alternatives until you're paralyzed by them. And so the answer isn't to suppress the thinking. It's to recognize what it's trying to do and what it's trying to avoid. Sometimes overthinking is protecting you from asking the real question: what do I actually want? Because once you ask that, things become real. And with reality comes risk, of failure, of rejection, of having to change your life. But this is also where freedom begins. Because behind the loop is a voice you haven't heard in a long time. The one that speaks quietly, not to keep you safe, but to keep you whole. Overthinking isn't a flaw in your mind. It's a signal from your soul. A signal that something is misaligned and thought is trying, desperately, to compensate for the silence. At some point, every overthinker reaches a threshold, not of information, but of exhaustion. You've read the articles, you've had the realizations, you've mapped out the patterns and understood the trauma. You know the psychology. You've intellectualized the pain. And still, you're stuck. Not because you're missing one last insight, but because you've been using thought to outrun something only the heart can resolve. There's a moment in the healing process that no one tells you about. It's not loud. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It's quiet, almost imperceptible. You don't find a new answer. You just stop trying to think your way out of your life and start feeling your way back into it. That moment, however small, is a turning point. Because underneath the mental storm is a truth you've been circling for years. You don't need more thoughts. You need more truth. And truth doesn't always arrive in language. Sometimes it arrives in stillness, in tears, in presence. Sometimes it arrives in the moment you finally stop trying to make sense of everything and let yourself simply be. This is not passivity. This is surrender, not to fate, but to your own depth. To the parts of you that don't speak in words, but still know what's right. To the instincts you've silenced. To the emotions you've pathologized. To the self you've neglected in your pursuit of perfection. Overthinking isn't the enemy. It was trying to protect you. But protection becomes a prison when it no longer serves the truth. Carl Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that darkness, that discomfort, that uncertainty, that fear, is not there to break you. It's there to wake you. So if your mind won't stop spinning, maybe the answer isn't to think less. Maybe it's to listen differently, to feel what you've been avoiding, to choose, not with certainty, but with courage. You are not addicted to thought. You are addicted to avoiding your own truth. And it's time to come home to it. If this resonated with you, like, share, and subscribe to The Existential Edge for more videos like this.